Okay, why don't we begin? And let's begin just by reminding you that according to the syllabus, there's an exam in about 2 weeks or so, a little bit more than 2 weeks. Wednesday, October 22nd. The Monday before, I'll do a kind of in-class review, so I'll be here to be able to take questions that any of you might have. If you've got a accommodation through the Disabled Students Program, and I haven't received your accommodation letter, please get that taken care of soon, because the DSP does proctoring for us to give you guys the extra time that you're entitled to, and we just want to make sure we get all those ducks in a row. Anyway, the exam's going to look just like all my previous exams, except it's going to be a little bit shorter, I think. Current plans now call for 15 to 20 short answer questions. And by short answer, I mean short answer. Just a couple of sentences is all we need. If you look at the previous exams, all of which are posted to the B Courses website, you'll see what kinds of exams I give and what kinds of answers we're looking for. And it's going to cover basically everything in the course to date, including the series of 4 lectures that starts today. Lots of resources for the exam. We'll have that Q&A session that I told you about. All the lecture illustrations are or will be, these will be on the course website. The lecture supplements for those of you who like to read and as well as listen. There is a narrative review on the B Courses website as well as all the past exams. And there'll be a special discussion page on B Courses that'll be devoted to questions pertaining to the midterm exam. So that's plenty of resources, I think. We'll talk more about this as time goes on. All right. The chief problem of consciousness from a scientific point of view is that consciousness is inherently subjective and private and personal. And science is supposed to be objective and public and impersonal. So the real challenge for a scientific approach to consciousness is how you're going to do that, okay? How are you going to study objectively something that's inherently subjective? How are you going to make a public science out of something that's inherently private? This problem is hard enough when we're talking about conscious mental states. When I tell you what I perceive or what I think or what I'm feeling or what I'm wanting, I mean, how do you know that I'm reporting accurately? That's generally thought of as the problem of introspection. But it's even more acute when you start entertaining the possibility of unconscious mental states, which by their very nature aren't susceptible to introspection precisely because they're unconscious. We're not aware of what we're perceiving or remembering or thinking or feeling or wanting. How are you going to make a science out of that? Well, people have tried, and we're going to talk about that for the next several sessions. But just to kind of lay the foundation, draw your attention to some work by a philosopher, prominent writer in the area of consciousness studies, Ned Block, who distinguished between 2 kinds of consciousness, what he called P consciousness and A consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness, what Block called phenomenal consciousness, is the consciousness we've been talking about. Your experiences, your awareness of perceiving the world or remembering the past or whatever it is that you're aware of. The philosophical term for this sometimes is experiential states. But Block also argued on the basis of a bunch of evidence that there was also a second kind of consciousness which he called access consciousness, where there's information in the mind that interacts with conscious mental states even though you're not conscious of the information itself. So you got 2 kinds of mental states here now. You've got the conscious mental states, and you've got these unconscious mental states that interact with them. And he talks in these papers about how to kind of motivate this distinction. In one case, he says, look, you can have phenomenal consciousness without access consciousness. There's all sorts of background noise that goes on when you're going about your business in the ordinary course of everyday living. And you're not paying any attention to it at all. You don't have any access to those things that are going on. You're just kind of focused on what your phenomenal experience is. But Bloch also pointed out that you can have access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness. And the case he gave, a case I'll discuss in more detail on Wednesday, is the case of blind sight, where there are some patients with a particular form of brain damage to the striate cortex back here in the visual area, who are blind. They have a scotoma that renders them blind for certain parts of space. It's not usually the whole of space, but you knock out a little bit of your striate cortex and you're going to have a blind spot maybe up there in the upper left-hand portion of the visual field. These patients have no phenomenal experience in that part of space. Yet, under some circumstances, they seem to be able to make correct judgments about objects and events that occur in that part of visual space. So there's some kind of perceptual representation of what's out there that's interacting with their behavior, even though it's outside of conscious awareness. And it's this problem, what Bloch called access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness, that we're going to talk about for the next several times. Bloch raised this distinction famously in the 1990s and even more recently, but it's actually a distinction that goes back a long way in the philosophy of mind. Immanuel Kant, in he wrote a book that he called Anthropology, which is really a psychology textbook. In fact, it's actually the first psychology textbook, and it's pretty good for something that wasn't even a science yet. But Kant entertained this proposition that we could have ideas and yet not be conscious of them. And he said, look, I think that's got to be possible, right? But there's a real contradiction here, because how do we know that we have these ideas if we can't be conscious of them? And he basically offered the general framework for the solution, which is to say that we become indirectly aware of these things, that we have an idea even though we don't know what that idea is. And what he really meant by that is we can become indirectly aware by simply observing our own behavior and making inferences about the kind of mental state that must be there in order for us to behave the way we do. Okay, so that's the problem, the end of the 18th century that Kant set out, and it's one that William James grappled with as well at the end of the 19th century, where he talked about this distinction between the unconscious and the conscious being of the mental state. This distinction between between conscious and unconscious mental states is a kind of tumbling ground for whimsies, in James's favorite phrase, the sovereign means for believing what one likes in psychology and of turning what might become a science into a tumbling ground for whimsies. Now, the interesting thing about this quote is that James himself was perfectly willing to accept the idea that we have and are influenced by mental states that we're not consciously aware of. James was writing at the heyday of late 19th century studies of hysteria, people who were blind or deaf or had various kinds of tactile anesthesias or multiple personality disorders, who seemed not to be aware of certain kinds of percepts or memories or whatever, but nonetheless their behavior was shaped by them. So James is not rejecting the idea of unconscious mental life in this quote. What he's saying is that you gotta have good reason for attributing unconscious states to people, because otherwise you can do a tremendous amount of mischief by simply saying, you perceive a dragon on a bicycle over here by the door, and you say, no, I don't. And I say, well, see, you're just not aware of perceiving it. Okay? So you can see what kind of mischief this can do. The kind of mischief that came along just a little bit later with Sigmund Freud, who spent most of his career telling his patients that they were bothered by unconscious memories of things that, of course, they couldn't remember them because they had repressed them. Okay? This is the tumbling ground for whimsies that James was concerned about. And he said, look, if you're going to attribute unconscious mental states to people, you better have pretty good evidence, okay? The kind of evidence that would be acceptable in other kinds of domains. Okay, all of that is background. We've already seen one example of unconscious mental life in the last series of lectures when we talked about automaticity, because what the literature on automaticity tells us is that there are mental processes that can be unconscious in the strict sense of the term, that they operate outside of phenomenal awareness and independent of our voluntary control. This is what we talk about pre-attentive processing or pre-conscious processing. The very terms suggest that there's no conscious awareness of the processing. But these automatic processes themselves operate on mental states, okay? There are percepts that are operated on by automatic processes that generate other percepts. Or there are memories that are operated on by automatic processes that generate various kinds of thoughts and ideas. In the automaticity literature, the implication is that the contents, the mental contents that these processes operate on are themselves conscious, or at least accessible to consciousness. If you think about John Barge's ideas about automaticity, you have a conscious mental state. You consciously perceive something that automatically evokes some process that turns into some other conscious mental state. That's the general idea. The question now is different. The question is, can mental states themselves be unconscious? Okay, and if they are, how would we know? Can beliefs and feelings and desires and all that other good stuff that we ordinarily think of as the contents of consciousness, can they influence our ongoing experience, thought, and action outside of phenomenal awareness and perhaps even independently of conscious control? Okay? So that's the agenda. And let's dip back into our philosophy for just a second. Not too long, not too much, because this isn't a philosophy course. But just kind of try to get clarification about what we mean by mental states. And here, refer you back to a discussion in the lectures on introspection, and this idea from Franz Brentano that intentionality is the mark of the mental. That's a quote from him. And remember, he's using intentionality in the German philosophical sense of aboutness. That is to say, every mental state is about something other than itself. I've got a mental state right now that's about that table and chair. I've got a mental state right now that's about that Wi-Fi connector, and so on. So that's what we mean by intentionality. James made the same point in his 5 characters of consciousness when he pointed out that mental states deal with objects independent of themselves, that they're cognitive, that the whole point of a mental state is that we have some knowledge about something in the world. And then Professor Searle makes exactly the same point when he argues, citing Brentano, that mental states have content, that is, that they refer to specific features of the world. So that's what we're talking about. We're going to talk about mental representations of past or present or future events